Laken Tomlinson goes to the Jets, 3 years, $40 million, $27 million guaranteed. So more guaranteed at signing, I guess. Than I don't know if it's 27 guaranteed at signing.
Yeah, I think that's the equivalent of like the Crosby 53.
Yeah. Okay. So 3 years, $40 million, $27 million. Laken Tomlinson is reunited with Mike LaFleur and Robert Saleh. This is what, I mean, we talked about on the podcast the other day. This was just not going to be a player the Niners could participate with.
No, I mean, this is part of doing business in the NFL, man. Especially, we talked about this yesterday. Guard centers, I'd say D tackles, sometimes linebackers, third wide receivers. The money changes depending on the position, but we saw this happen to Kendrick Bourne. You get credit, whether it's an undrafted free agent and then he signs somewhere else. You get credit for trading a 5th-round pick for a bust, then turning him into a starter on a team that won 4 playoff games with him starting at left guard next to Joe Staley and Trent Williams, and then having him leave at 31 years old. I would say I would have been much more aggressive, and they probably would have been too, extending him like to a big money thing if he was 27 years old. I do think the age impacts, right? He's 31. So, there's a balance of he's a guard. Like, he could still have an excellent couple years and be worth every penny, right? I bet the Jets, if he starts every game the next 2 years and just plays at his level, they'll be fine
and
with
protect
it.
Zach Wilson.
Yeah, but I also think that, like, you only have every team in the NFL. I've been reiterating this over and over because Howie said it at the Combine, and he's so right. Like, every team in the NFL has the same amount of resources. We all have the same amount of picks. We all have the same amount of money. We just get to choose how we utilize it, right? You see the Rams. Like, they've had the same amount of picks as everyone else. They just use them differently. The Niners last year chose to use 3 first-round picks on Trey Lance. You get to choose, do you want to give Khalil Mack a bunch of money, or do you want to give right tackle a bunch of It's just, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Every single year you see teams that make runs that have different amount of, money allocated to a certain position. Sometimes, obviously, the quarterback's going to be the most important. But I had this thought today because I saw some things on Twitter of like, it's risky starting, because I think Aaron Banks, the guy they drafted in the second round, is going to be penciled as a starter going into the season. Now, I bet the way that they verbalize it will be competition, as most teams do, but they're going to want him to start, as they should. He's got to earn it. I mean, they're not just going to throw him out there if he sucks, but he's going to get every possibility, I think, to start. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And it's like, this is a big risk. And it's like, well, part of drafting athletic quarterbacks, like, I think you'd want a better O-line the last 3 or 4 years in like Seattle, but like, or the Deshaun Watson when he was with, like, is moving around, right? Isn't that a huge added element to Trey? I think it's clear he's not probably as fast as a lot of people would have hoped when they acquired like this running quarterback.
Well, his GPS numbers was what like everyone kept talking about. But most guys, you don't run 40 yards in a straight line all the time.
But I think Deshaun Watson's a good comp. You just need him to run around behind the line of scrimmage. I don't even really want him running that much. Just keep plays alive and then throw deep. Josh Allen style. Now, probably more Mahomes style. I'm not comparing him to Patrick Mahomes. My point is that like Josh is a true runner. Josh plays fast. Trey Lance in the 2 games, and he might get faster with more confidence. Didn't play that fast, but he did move a lot better than Jimmy, right behind the line of scrimmage, just moving around.
Yeah. I think this is part of this Laken thing. Like, if we look back now, we're coming into, believe it or not, but we're coming into John Lynch and Adam Peters and Kyle Shanahan's 6th draft. Okay, 6th draft.
Wow.
In their first draft,
time flies.
Yeah. In their first draft, they got 2 like legitimate starters, George Kittle and DJ Jones, plus Ahkello Witherspoon, who did start for them. In their next draft, they got Mike McGlinchey and Fred Warner, DJ Reed, Marcel Harris, Richie James, Contavious Street, Tarvarius Moore. Like that was a good draft, right? I mean, McGlinchey and Pettis was a complete whiff. McGlinchey has not been what they hoped, but they got Fred Warner, and it was, by draft standards, I think a pretty deep draft for them. In 19, they got Bosa and Debo, plus their starting punter, plus Dre Greenlaw. Okay?
That's good. That's pretty good.
In 20, they got
now the one thing they benefited there, and I've always said this about Balky in his latter years, this latter year with Harbaugh and those couple years that ultimately got him fired. the Bosa Debo, they drafted fucking really high.
Totally. But so so then the next draft, they got Ayuk and Juwan Jennings, who were both major contributors this year, plus Kinlaw, plus McKivitz, who had to play a little, more than a little, and Charlie Warner, who played and, gave them has given them 6-round tight end production, right? Like you'll replace him when you can. Then this last year, they drafted Trey Lance, Aaron Banks, Trey Sermon, Ambry Thomas, Jalen Moore, Lenore Hufanga, and Mitchell. Right now, you'd say, here are the starters we know from this last draft class. Trey Lance, Elijah Mitchell.
Hufanga played a lot.
He played a lot. Could they go into the year with him as a starting?
I think ideally he's a third safety.
Okay.
But that's a good pick, right? In the late rounds.
Ambry, I think, is set up right now to be. He became a starting corner, so now we're at 3.5 starters.
Improved every game. I give him a lot of credit. He got a lot better, and I was hard on him. He got a lot better.
So, and now Aaron Banks, right? If Aaron Banks is their starting guard,
does Elijah Mitchell cancel out Trey Sermon?
That's kind of what I'm getting at. Is we spent a lot of time talking about Trey Sermon, but we're looking at the potential of 4.5 starters they got out of this last draft. And we haven't even, where that means we're putting Diamador Lenore as not one right now. We're giving a half a starter to Hufanga. And, Jalen Moore played some important snaps for them last year.
To me, if you get quote unquote half starters, meaning that I think ideally they're the third guy at their position, right? If there's 2 tackles, you're the third tackle. If there are 2 safeties, you're the third safety type deal.
Yeah.
You're a half starter in the 6th, 7th, 5th round. I'm totally cool with that, right? Yeah. That means you get guys that can play on game day, they can start. There is tangible pressure. Obviously on Trey, but I would say on Aaron Banks, a 2nd round guard. He's got to be. He's got to be just a plug and play starter. I don't need him to be a Pro Bowler. But he's got to be can he just start for the next 3 years at 200? Not 200 grand. He probably makes, $1 million. That's a huge addition to your team. That's the swing, right? You let a guy go that's going to make – they would have loved to keep – if all things were equal, they'd be like, can we just keep this guy? But it's just there's a money element of you can save literally $12 million a year if this guy is just 85% of them. And at one point in time, I was thinking about this today, about him specifically. Part of – and you've always said this about your head coach, part of the value in Kyle is when you do have turnover at quarterback, he really gets to impact that. Or – the Brandon Ayuk, you get to work through that with the play caller, with Debo and everything. He gets, obviously his scheme is so connected, and every scheme is, but his specifically because he's so run heavy to the O-line. And Forrester has been his guy now, a Shanahan guy for a decade. That should be a huge advantage to get the best possible outcome out of Aaron Banks. Because they did it with Laken Tomlinson. Now, Tomlinson was, to me, a legitimate, first-round guy. I think there were some people that said, I viewed Aaron Banks more as a late 3rd, early 4th. They drafted him the 2nd. He does come, and listen, once you're in the NFL, where you come from and where you were drafted is kind of irrelevant, but he does come from Notre Dame, who's had, McGlinchey is not worth the 9th pick, it turns out, but McGlinchey could just be an 8, 9-year starter at right tackle, right? And if those are your misses, you're in good shape. The problem with the Niners early on, right, their misses were Reuben Foster, and it's just you can't have that.
Well, it's also you miss on a first rounder. Did you hit Fred Warner? Ultimately your hits matter where they come because of the amount of money you allocate, right? And it's just a value game that you're always talking about.
And can your miss function, right? So Trey Sermon, can he become your backup running back behind Elijah and just get 5-6 carries a game? Then you're ideally Elijah would have been our 3rd round pick, but ultimately it doesn't matter. They're both on 4-year contracts, right? But can that guy not make the team? In 2 years, is Trey Sermon he's not even good enough to be the top 3 back? That's the problem. But if I just tell you he's a backup, you're in good shape.
Yeah.
But I don't know he can be a backup. Just are you confident that week 7, assuming health, or week 6 or week 10, Aaron Banks is a starter?
Well, assuming health, what are your options right now? Do they end up drafting another guard in the top 3 rounds? Maybe they do, but
they might because Brunskill, they have an old center, an old guard. I think they're going to draft I'll be very surprised if one of their, because they got 2/3 and a second, like a guy that's viewed as like, this guy can play guard and center. I would expect that pick on the second day of the draft from the 49ers, wouldn't you?
Yes. Yeah. But bottom line, John, ultimately, last year they drafted Aaron Banks with the intention that they would not re-sign Laken Tomlinson. They did not re-sign Laken Tomlinson. So we are moving down the path of what that plan was.
But I think part of it on the Tomlinson, he's probably being let go, whether Aaron Banks on the roster or not. They just would have to be aggressive.
They would have to go find the next guy.
Because it happens. A couple years ago, I think it was last year actually, because this Chargers big free agent signing was Corey Linsley, the center from the Green Bay. What did Green Bay do? Drafted a center in the mid-rounds. He immediately starts. So it's like sometimes you don't always control the path of how you get there. Because they might say, well, listen, we don't know Aaron Banks going to be good or not yet. We might just draft again and just let it compete and just let the cream rise. And hell, maybe they both end up starting. Or maybe Aaron gets beat out. I think you got to draft a guard center type guy probably in the top 70 picks. In that group of your 2/3 and your